Nearly 10,000 people are living in a city in the middle of the ocean. There are no water pipelines, no supermarkets, no power grid connecting it to the mainland. They still eat, shower, swim, watch shows, and go about their daily lives just like people in any ordinary city. But there is one major difference. This city doesn't stand on land. It is drifting in the middle of the ocean. It has to produce its own water, generate its own energy, deliver food to thousands of people, and deal with everything they leave behind, all while continuing to move. So how does a floating city like this actually operate? This is Icon of the Seas, a massive city that can move itself across the ocean. From a distance, Icon of the Seas looks like a massive building floating on the surface of the sea. But as you get closer, its true scale becomes difficult to comprehend. A structure hundreds of meters long and dozens of decks high, yet instead of standing on land, the entire structure is floating and moving across the ocean. The ship is about 365 meters long and has a gross tonnage of around 250,000 GT. This number is not the ship's weight. It is a measure of the total enclosed space within this enormous structure moving across the ocean. Inside this enormous structure are guest rooms, restaurants, machinery, equipment, technical areas, and countless spaces designed to serve a population comparable to that of a small town. But what makes Icon of the Seas different is not just its size. Once you step aboard, you almost stop feeling like you're inside a means of transportation. There are dozens of restaurants and bars, shopping areas, theaters, swimming pools, a water park, and entertainment spaces spread across multiple decks. Some areas are even designed to resemble small neighborhoods. There are trees, walkways, restaurants, and open spaces connecting different areas, giving passengers the feeling of moving through a massive resort rather than walking through the decks of a ship. At the bow, Aquadome creates an entirely different scene. A massive glass and steel structure covers a multi-level space, combining a stage, a pool, and performance areas inside. And all of it sits on a structure moving across the ocean. But the scale of Icon of the Seas isn't just about what it contains. It's also about how many people it has to serve at the same time. The ship can carry around 7,600 passengers, along with approximately 2,350 crew members. When everyone is on board, nearly 10,000 people can be on the ship. Imagine a normal morning. Thousands of people wake up, go to eat, use the elevators, head to the pools, take part in activities, and then return to their rooms. At the same time, countless crew members are working to keep all of those spaces running normally. But there is one major difference. This city doesn't stand still. It has to carry nearly 10,000 people, along with its entire massive structure, and keep moving hundreds of kilometers across the ocean. And that immediately raises a more important question. How can a structure 365 meters long, rising 20 decks high, and measuring around 250,000 GT in gross tonnage, actually move itself across the ocean? Because beneath those restaurants, pools, and entertainment areas is a world that passengers almost never see. A massive machine is turning fuel into energy, and then turning that energy into movement for this entire city. A massive ship, carrying thousands of people and all of its systems, cannot move on its own. To move all of that mass across the ocean, Icon of the Seas needs a propulsion system to match, and its most important components lie deep beneath the entertainment areas passengers are enjoying above. At the heart of this system are 6 dual-fuel engines. They can use LNG, or liquefied natural gas, along with conventional marine fuel to generate power for the ship. But LNG is not an ordinary fuel. To keep it in liquid form, it has to be maintained at around -162 degrees Celsius. That means just beneath the pools and restaurants is a fuel system designed to handle a substance cold enough to be almost unimaginable. When the fuel is burned in the engines, the mechanical energy drives electrical generators. The electricity produced is then distributed to the ship's systems and electric propulsion system, helping move the vessel. This is the basic principle of a diesel-electric system. The engines drive generators, while electricity from those generators powers the propulsion motors. In other words, the engines below don't just push the ship forward, they also provide power for a city of nearly 10,000 people eating, relaxing, and enjoying themselves above. And at this point, we've solved only half the problem. Having enough power to move a massive ship forward doesn't mean it will remain stable when the sea turns rough. Imagine a structure rising 20 decks high, moving through large waves. Wind pushes against the structure above. Waves act on the hull below, while thousands of people, pieces of equipment, and other masses are distributed throughout the ship. So beyond its propulsion system, the ship also needs other systems to control its balance and limit its movement in waves and wind. The engines move this city forward, but what keeps the entire city from tipping over in the middle of the ocean? A ship 365 meters long and rising 20 decks high is moving across the ocean. Just looking at its size raises an obvious question: how can something this massive stay balanced on the water? The first answer lies in how weight is distributed throughout the ship. Heavy components aren't placed randomly. Much of the weight is positioned lower down, helping keep the center of gravity of the entire structure at an appropriate level. This is especially important for a ship that rises dozens of decks above the water. If too much weight is concentrated high up, wind and waves can create greater tilting forces. By keeping the heavier components lower, the ship tends to return toward a balanced position after being tilted. But a low center of gravity still isn't enough to handle every condition at sea. Beneath the ship are also large tanks containing water and other liquids. These fluids can be distributed between different areas to help control the ship's balance as conditions change. Imagine a large tray floating on the water. If the weight shifts to one side, the tray tilts. When the weight is redistributed, it can regain its balance. The same basic principle applies to a massive ship, except everything happens on a vastly larger scale. And of course, the hull itself plays a critical role. The hull beneath the waterline is designed to generate enough buoyancy to support the ship's entire mass, while also determining how the vessel interacts with the water as it moves. But the ocean is not a perfectly still surface. When waves hit the hull, the ship moves with the water. Wind also acts on the structure, rising dozens of decks above the surface, adding forces that can make the ship tilt and roll. That's where the stabilizers come into play. These devices beneath the hull can extend outward when needed, generating forces that counter the ship's side-to-side rolling motion and reduce the movement passengers feel in rough seas. And this system isn't simply switched on and left alone. Sensors continuously monitor the ship's movement and changes in the surrounding environment. When necessary, the control system can adjust the stabilizers to reduce unwanted motion. But there's something important to understand. The ship doesn't remain completely still. When it encounters large waves, it still rises and falls with the water. It can still tilt slightly and still respond to wind and the forces of the ocean. The goal of the stabilization system isn't to make the ship completely motionless. It's to keep those movements within safe limits. Through the combination of a low center of gravity, weight distribution, the hull, and stabilization systems, a structure rising 20 decks high can continue its journey across the ocean without turning every wave into a battle for balance. But keeping the ship afloat and stable solves only the first problem. Because above those systems beneath the waterline, nearly 10,000 people are still living, eating, and using all the amenities of a floating city. The ship can keep itself stable on the ocean, but what will nearly 10,000 people on board live on? Nearly 10,000 people living on a ship need an enormous amount of water every day. Water isn't just for drinking. It's also needed for cooking, showering, laundry, cleaning guest rooms and restaurants, and countless other activities happening continuously on board. If this were a city on land, water could be delivered through a network of pipelines. But Icon of the Seas can't connect to a municipal water supply in the middle of the ocean, and carrying all the fresh water needed for an entire voyage would add an enormous amount of weight. So when the ship is hundreds of kilometers from land, Where does it get its water? From the very things surrounding it. Seawater is drawn into the ship's desalination system. One of the key technologies used is reverse osmosis. In this process, seawater is pressurized and forced through specialized membranes. Water molecules can pass through, while most of the salt and other dissolved substances are held back. Instead of carrying its entire supply of fresh water from land, the ship can draw seawater from beneath the hull and turn it into water for life on board. And this system has to operate on a massive scale. According to published information, around 93% of the fresh water used on board can be produced on the ship itself, while the remainder can be supplied from land, depending on the voyage and demand. Imagine a normal morning. Thousands of people are using bathrooms, restrooms, restaurants, and public spaces at the same time. Every faucet that is turned on, every meal that is prepared, and every room that is cleaned creates a demand for water. Water has to be pumped to the right areas, treated according to different needs, and continuously circulated through various systems throughout the ship. It isn't simply brought in and used once. It has to be distributed and managed according to the different demands on board. Passengers barely notice any of this. When someone turns on a faucet in their bathroom, behind that simple action is an entire system that begins with seawater outside the ship. But water solves only one of the most basic needs. Nearly 10,000 people still have to eat every day. And unlike seawater, which can be drawn directly from outside, a meal can't be created simply by opening a valve. Tons of food have to be brought aboard, stored, moved through the ship's logistics areas, and delivered to the right kitchens and restaurants at exactly the right time. If the ship can turn seawater into fresh water, how does it feed this entire floating city? Seawater can be turned into fresh water, but food can't simply be produced on board. With nearly 10,000 people on Icon of the Seas, thousands of meals have to be prepared in advance and moved through a logistics system that operates continuously. The chain begins at the port, where food is loaded onto the ship before the voyage begins. Meat, fish, produce, eggs, bread, beverages, and frozen products are received in large quantities and then moved into storage areas deep inside the ship. Ingredients that require low temperatures are stored in refrigerated or frozen storage areas. Other foods are organized according to their storage requirements and planned use, so thousands of meals can be prepared throughout the voyage. But this is only the beginning. From storage, food enters the ship's internal logistics system and is transported to kitchens on different decks. Ingredients stored below may have to pass through multiple areas before reaching the exact place where they will be prepared. When a passenger sits down at a restaurant and orders a meal, they see only the final step of the entire process. Before that, the ingredients have been loaded at the port, stored under the right conditions, retrieved at the right time, and transported to the right kitchen. And all of it has to happen while the ship is still moving across the ocean. The scale becomes even clearer when not just one, but dozens of restaurants and dining areas all need to be supplied. Thousands of passengers may eat within the same period of time, turning the preparation and distribution of ingredients into a serious logistics challenge. There is no supermarket downstairs where crew members can run to pick up a few extra boxes when supplies start running low. Everything needed for the voyage has to be calculated and prepared in advance. Above deck, passengers see only a restaurant, a menu, and a meal being placed on the table. But behind that meal is an entire chain of movement, turning shipments of food brought aboard from land into thousands of meals served every day to a city drifting across the ocean. And then those very meals create another problem. Food is brought aboard, stored, prepared, passengers eat. But when it's all over, where does everything left behind go? Because nearly 10,000 people don't just create thousands of meals every day, they also generate a huge amount of waste and discarded material. And in the middle of the ocean, the ship can't simply dump all of it into the sea. Nearly 10,000 people eat, shower, and go about their daily lives on the same ship every day. So alongside tons of food consumed and enormous amounts of water used, a huge amount of waste is continuously generated. The problem is that Icon of the Seas doesn't have a landfill sitting behind it, where everything can simply be taken away. What a city on land can send outside, this floating city has to find a way to handle on board. Let's start with the most visible things: bottles, aluminum cans, paper containers, cardboard, and food packaging. They are separated into different streams. Some materials are shredded or compacted to reduce their volume before being stored or sent for further processing. But solid waste is only the most visible part. A city of nearly 10,000 people also produces a large amount of wastewater every day. Water from showers, toilets, and kitchens has to pass through treatment systems before it can be discharged under the regulations that apply to ships. Then there is food waste. Thousands of people eating every day means a large amount of organic waste from dining areas and kitchens. But on Icon of the Seas, some of this waste can also be processed in a very different way. The ship is equipped with a waste-to-energy system that uses microwave-assisted pyrolysis to convert some organic waste into syngas, which can then be used as energy for systems on board. In other words, some of what was just thrown away can come back to serve the ship itself, in another form of energy. But the best way to deal with food waste is still not to create it in the first place. Tracking how much food is used and left over allows operators to adjust how much needs to be prepared, reducing the amount that goes to waste. But the point here isn't how green Icon of the Seas is. It's a much simpler reality. There is nowhere to throw all of this away. In the middle of the ocean, every type of waste has to be treated, recycled, or stored according to its own process. Any remaining materials can only be taken ashore when the ship reaches port. From above, passengers barely see any trace of this process, but below deck, the treatment systems continue operating throughout the voyage. And to keep those systems running without stopping, another team has to be working deep inside the ship. When passengers wake up, a new day on Icon of the Seas is already underway. Breakfast is being prepared, restaurants are opening, pools are filling up again, and the entertainment areas are gradually becoming crowded. But behind everything passengers can see, another workday began long ago. Behind the passenger areas are narrower corridors, doors off limits to guests, and technical spaces that are almost completely hidden from view. This is where the systems that keep the entire ship running are monitored and maintained. On the bridge, officers continue monitoring the voyage. The ship's position, heading, speed, weather, and sea conditions all have to be monitored continuously to keep the journey safe. Many systems can automatically monitor conditions and respond to changes, but automation doesn't mean the ship can operate without people. When an abnormal reading appears, someone still has to examine the data, assess the situation, and decide what to do next. Machines can detect a change, but people are still responsible for the decisions. Deeper below is the world of engineers and technical staff. They work with engines, electrical systems, water systems, air conditioning, pumps, and countless pieces of equipment that passengers usually notice only when something goes wrong. When an elevator keeps running, a room still has hot water, or a restaurant still has power, it means that somewhere behind the scenes, the systems responsible are being monitored and maintained. But the city below isn't made up of engineers alone. Above, thousands of crew members are also moving through the areas passengers see every day. Chefs prepare food, restaurant staff serve guests, housekeeping cleans rooms and public areas, while security personnel monitor spaces where thousands of people may gather. What's remarkable is that much of this work is done so that passengers never notice it's happening. A clean room means the work was completed before the guest returned. A restaurant operating normally means dozens of tasks behind the scenes happened at the right time. And there is never a moment when everything on the ship stops at once. When one crew shift ends, another takes over. One engineer leaves the engine room and another continues monitoring the systems. One housekeeping team finishes an area, while another begins preparing the next. That's why the rhythm of crew life is completely different from that of the passengers. Passengers may end their day with dinner, watch a show, and return to their rooms. Once the door closes behind them, it can feel as though the day on the ship has ended too. But the ship never stops. The engines keep running. The electrical systems are still being monitored. Water is still being treated. Food is still being prepared for the next day. On the bridge, the officers on duty continue watching over the ship in the middle of the ocean. When most passengers have fallen asleep, somewhere below, an engineer is still checking machinery, a crew member is still cleaning, and a chef is preparing for the next morning's shift. Nearly 10,000 people above can sleep, but this city never truly turns its lights off, and perhaps that's the easiest thing to overlook when looking at Icon of the Seas. We see the pools, restaurants, parks, and massive entertainment areas. But for all of that to operate normally in the middle of the ocean, a team of people has to keep working behind the scenes. For one city to drift across the ocean, another city has to quietly exist inside it. From a distance, Icon of the Seas becomes little more than a massive structure in the middle of the ocean. From the outside, we see the decks, pools, restaurants, and entertainment areas. But now we know that behind them is a complex system constantly producing water, supplying energy, delivering food to thousands of people, processing waste, and keeping everything on board running. And all of it has to happen while the entire city is still moving across the ocean. What we see above the water is only the visible part of Icon of the Seas. The rest is an invisible city quietly keeping this floating city alive.